Good afternoon, everyone. Please continue eating, but we do need to get started because we want to present some material to you so that we can have a time of interaction towards the end. My name is Todd Johnson. I am director of the Center for the Study of Global Christianity on campus. And you're here today with us to celebrate the publication of Evangelicals Around the World, a global handbook for the 21st century. And we actually have several people in the room who were involved in the project, and we're going to ask various people to come up and just say a little bit about it. We're going to start out with the main editor here in just a minute. Those of you that were in chapel heard Brian Stiller speak. He's the global ambassador for the World Evangelical Alliance, travels all over, probably has met more different kinds of evangelicals than just about anybody based on his job. So that put him in a unique position, and I think the project kind of got its initial nudge, to use your language from chapel, when you were visiting. Well, at least it got another nudge when you came down to visit and met with some of the faculty here, and it seemed like a really good thing to do, and here it is after a few years. And we actually have some copies for sale at a radical discount, almost half off, and they'll be available towards the end of the time. So Brian, why don't you come up and talk about the book, and then I'll invite several people up in the next few minutes.
When I took on this role with World Evangelical Alliance, our Secretary General asked me to write a book because we were having a major conference. And I've written a few in my life, and so I said, okay, I'll think about it. But I found no burning issue. There was nothing that really interested me. I thought everything I had thought about I had written. Like I accused Tony Campolo once that he does not have an unwritten thought. But one day, my wife and I, we took some time with our family in Florida, and I was bumping around through Barnes & Noble, and I came across this book, Evangelicals for Idiots. You know, the Idiots series. And so I picked it up, and I flipped through it, and I was surprised at how good it was. But, of course, all it was about was America. And, of course, this might come as a surprise to a few of you that there is other places than America, like Canada. There we go. Hey, the Blue Jays are going to win tomorrow night. We whipped the Yankees and the Boston. Wasn't that wonderful? God is still on the throne. So from that, I thought maybe if we define ourselves globally, it would be of help. My wife and I had just gone down through Egypt, and I remember down in a town in Upper Egypt, which is South Egypt, a church had been burned to the ground, and I thought, if that pastor had a book that he could give to an imam and say, we really are part of a 600 million person body worldwide, he wouldn't think of that church as some little cult or sect. So this began to formulate. I met Todd, came to Gordon-Conwell. We met with, 4 or 5 professors. We thought about it, began to plan it out. The wife of my nephew, Karen Stiller, she's managing editor of a magazine I started in Canada some years ago called Faith Today. And I talked to Mark Knoll and Chris Wright, and from there an outline began to emerge. And over the next 3.5 years, we got Thomas Nelson. They were excited about it, and they came on board, and we brought together about 50 writers, and it eventually came out with this Around the World. Let me just tell you, when I was in Albania a few weeks ago, speaking at a Catholic conference, and on peace, and there were some Muslims there as well. And I was on a panel with a imam from the largest mosque in Lahore, Pakistan. And so he was very intrigued by the things we were saying, and he said, do you have any information about you? And I said, well, could I give you this book? And so I gave him this book, and he was delighted. But he brought that book to an evening session, and next to him was the president of the University of Religion in Iran, the largest training seminary for imams in Iran. And he saw the book, and he said, can I have one too? And he began to look through it, and he said, would you come and visit us at our university? We're very interested in this. And I thought, Todd, it's amazing just what a little book will do to open doors, so you never know where it'll go. So thank you for all those, for Todd and for his enormous help to us. Todd knows a few things about Christianity around the world, almost as much as I've taught him. No, that's a little humor, folks, very little humor. There's nobody that knows more about the world and Christians in the world than Todd Johnson, and he gave us great strength to this. So get a book, folks. You'll love it. Such a deal. There you go.
So let me say what's in the book, so you get some idea. Really, the first half of the book is about evangelicals and various subjects. After we get through defining evangelicals, which is worth the price of the book, and what evangelicals believe, then we start to talk about evangelicals in the main line and ecumenism with Roman Catholics, with other religions, with missions, evangelism, evangelicals in prayer, and then we get down to evangelicals in gender. Quite a difficult assignment, and we're fortunate to have the author of that article with us today. And I'd like Aida Spencer, could you come up and tell us, how did you actually do this? How did you tackle this assignment?
So I was so honored to be invited to be part of this project, and it's something I've studied through the years. So what I did was this. I'll give you a little idea of the content and my approach. In terms of the content, I did a brief survey of women as leaders cited in the Bible, and what points evangelical differ over church leadership, the questions that are raised, the effect on women by institutionalization of the church. And the original research that I hadn't done before was looking at some of the current denominational differences on female ordination. And that's where some of the surprises are, is that some evangelical denominations ordained women before some more liberal denominations. But what I want to do as my approach is to begin places of agreement between egalitarian leaders and complementarian leaders. And it's interesting, later on, a writer who wrote different articles here, she wrote like her own little synopsis, but hers begins with places of disagreement. So I thought, I always think it's better to see where do we all agree, begin there, and then notice the differences. And I'll just read you a couple words here to remind you, those who believe in women in all areas of leadership and those who think there's limitations on women, where do we agree? This is some of the points. Authentic Christianity includes promoting the respect and dignity of women and men. So that is something that all agree on. The spiritual equality of women and men, modeling the love of Christ in every facet of life. In many evangelical denominations, the role of women in the church and the home has been decided, at least officially. We have some. And then in my own study of commentary on 1 Timothy, I did an in-depth study there of chapter 2. And there also I wanted to add what are some points of agreement. There, since that's a key thing comes up again and again, no matter whether egalitarian or hierarchicalist, is that 1 Timothy 2:12 is difficult to understand. And that many have come to appreciate that for Christian women to learn in silence is an exemplary virtue for all Christians. And I think that's come out into the scholarly world, maybe not into every church, but in the scholarly world. And also, many have also recognized that women were in some way promulgating or at least participating in the heresy at Ephesus. And what I've thought that's interesting is that some hierarchicalists emphasize the latter part of the verse, authentane, seeing teaching as one aspect of authority, interpreting authentane positively, and taking silence as somewhat literal. In contrast, egalitarians tend to emphasize the earlier part of verse 12, didaskain, and verse 11, seeing authentane as a misuse of power. So even with those couple verses, is what do you emphasize as well as difference in study. So it's a great project, and I thought the original price is, what, $35? If this is half price, $35 is pretty reasonable. It's got pictures and little heading. Hardcover, really strong. You know, this, you can throw it around and it'll still be okay. So I'm glad I have the whole volume as well.
Okay, it continues on from there to social justice, politics, evangelicals in the city. We even have a nice article on ethnodoxology. Some of you know Robin Harris, who's been here. Marketplace science, environmental stewardship, and so on. And then we get to another section in the book, which is geographical. So then we have articles on really the history of evangelicalism in Eastern Africa, Northern Africa, Southern Africa, Western Africa, Central America, North America, and finally we get down to Asia. And Eastern Asia was written by our own Dr. Yao. Would you come up and say a few words about writing a very short article about a very big subject?
You know, that's a challenge. So when Todd asked me to do that, and you know, I said to myself, sure, I know something about Christianity in China, in Korea, and Japan, but to write about their history and the contemporary, you know, the trends in such a huge region, and which vast populations, and including even Taiwan, and you know, and few Southeast Asia countries, and it's a huge challenge to me, you know. But it turned out to be, you know, I managed to do that, and I hope you know, and my writing is okay. But I'm telling you one thing is that I learned a great deal by writing this project. You know, I always find, you know, comparative study of churches in different countries is so helpful. You know, it's just shed light on something we have never been able to see if we just focus on our own little area and our own little countries. You know, just look beyond. I think that's God's way to help us to grow, and I truly believe that. Okay, that's probably the biggest lesson I learned from this book project. Okay, thank you for this opportunity.
Okay, it's not a history book, strictly speaking. It's a handbook, which means it has some really interesting stuff in it. One thing is pictures, so you get a sense of evangelicals around the world through pictures. The others is that we contributed quite a bit of demographics to it to show the size of evangelicalism, even measuring it in a couple of different ways all the way through the book. Some of you know we've actually presented right in this room the method that we've used for counting evangelicals. But if you take a very strict definition of just self-identification, it's about 300 million in 2010. And if you take a broader definition, like Operation World does, a theological definition, there's about 550 million in 2010. The idea that there's 600 million is from the continued growth of evangelicalism. It's probably well over 600 million now in 2015. So we presented some of those types of findings in the book. But there's actually a couple of hidden treasures in this book that I think really make it a handbook. One has to do with the chronology of evangelicalism from its beginning to the present, and the other is a collection of a who's who within evangelicalism from around the world. And these two difficult assignments were done by Bert Hickman from the center, and I'd like Bert to come up and say how in the world you actually ended up doing this. Thanks.
Well, these were two surprisingly difficult assignments. One of them you'll see up toward the front that I think is 200 events in evangelical history, and the other is Evangelicals You Would Want to Know. And even the title of that was a challenge because, a who's who of evangelicals or something like that, there's no way to list every significant evangelical that you might want to include. And so we had to really be sort of judicious. And so part of it was the center has a great resource in the World Christian Encyclopedia and the World Christian Database. We have a lot of information on events that have happened in Christian history, and of course we could draw from those events from evangelical history. And so that was a good starting point. And then to be able to fill in and say, okay, what's missing from different ages in history or different areas in history? What are things that leap out of, it's an obvious gap. If you were telling somebody who didn't know anything or didn't know much about evangelical history, what are things that absolutely ought to be included in there? And the same way with people. So who are the really significant people? I even asked some people, when you think of evangelicals, what names come to mind as significant evangelicals? And not scholarly people necessarily, but some scholars, but also just regular people. I ask my mom, who do you think of when you think of evangelicals? So, because the popular concept of who, and she's an evangelical, so it's not like you're asking somebody who knows nothing. But just to find a way to really identify people. Of course, some of the challenges are that how to condense events that could have huge impact into a couple of sentences, or even more so, how to condense events that people don't know anything about that have huge impact into a couple of sentences. So the chronology won't tell you everything about an event that happened in 1872. Maybe it'll inspire you to go and look and find out more about this thing that's listed there that you never knew happened. And with the people, it was a challenge as well because, again, people have different ideas of who is significant and what's significant. And the truth is, evangelical history, for most of it, it's been overwhelmingly English-speaking. And, U.S., Canada, Britain, Australia, New Zealand, that's where evangelicals mostly were. And so that's who evangelicals mostly were. And so a big challenge was trying to strike a balance between being historically accurate and faithful and also trying to be more inclusive of people from the rest of the world. And especially when the farther you go back in history, the fewer people and events there are to draw from that are majority world and even in Europe that are non-English speaking. So whether it's German or French or whatever, Scandinavia. And so those were some real challenges to have it not be so totally tilted toward and also the male-female dynamic, because for much of evangelical history, men were the leaders in things, and women played some very significant roles. And there are some women who are singled out as being significant women that you should know about in evangelicalism, but often women were the unsung heroines. So women were supporting their husbands, they were supporting their sons, they were busy in churches but didn't have official leadership roles. And so even though women are the majority of evangelicals today, they haven't always had the authority, and still in many places do take a more behind-the-scenes role. So how to recognize the contribution of women while acknowledging historically there are not as many women to draw from. So all of those were some of the challenges that went into things. And then different people from different backgrounds and parts of the world reviewed them, and we got into some pretty heated discussions about why have you left this person out? Why have you included this person? There was some real back and forth. I want my candidates for people you should know to be in there. And obviously we didn't want to have, 5 preachers from the same tradition from the same era being listed as evangelicals you should know, because that would, again, they could all be significant, but that makes you leave out other people who are equally significant. So how to pick that one, say, North American preacher from the 1890s or something to include was also a challenge. But we managed to come up with a list of people, and I guess, satisfy everybody that needed to be satisfied more or less with who these people are. So you will get a sense of, by looking at those people, the other criterion was we decided pretty early on that if they're alive, they had to be old. Because basically, I mean, Billy Graham's in his 90s, so he's a pretty safe person to put in there. But it's a sad reality that somebody in his 30s or 40s today who has many years of ministry left might have a huge impact, or he might run off the rails and lead people into error or have a big moral failure and be out of ministry. So to be safe, to include people that you ought to know, we said that people who are in active ministry and younger today get addressed elsewhere in the book. So we're going to go with the people that are, historic figures, and if they're alive today, they've had a long, proven track record. And so, again, so you don't see a lot of people, even that are in their 60s or 70s, say, because they just weren't quite old enough. I think even Brian Stiller wouldn't have been old enough to be in there as an evangelical that you should know. So he was.
I think we started. You had to be born before 1935 or something?
1940, yeah. You had to be born before 1940 to make it in there.
Before 1940.
Or you had to be dead. If you were born in 1960 and had already died, then you could get in there. But anyway, those are just some of the challenges in trying to give a comprehensive, brief, condensed, but it's thorough enough and interesting enough. And that's our hope, that you'll look at these people and you'll look at these events and you'll say, I want to know more about this person. I want to know about what happened in that year in that place. And that you'll then go out and do that.
Great.
Okay, hey, Bert, you didn't tell him that your mom said Bert Hickman to the question of who, and then we told your mom they had to be dead, and she said, please don't put him in there. Right? Yeah. She's very... Okay, so we're going to open up for questions now, and very important that you clearly state the question, and the answer has to be in the book, where we're not going to answer it. But so you haven't read the book, you can still try to guess what's in it. Anything about evangelicals around the world, any of the people, Brian, why don't you come up, and any of the people who've spoken, you can ask a question to them. Aida, you have to go pretty soon, right? So if you have a question on evangelicals and gender, maybe that should be the first one. Any questions? Yeah, that's right. How big is the first printing?
10,000.
Yeah, 10,000. Or the chapel, yeah, the chapel talk, if you want to ask Brian about his chapel talk. Here we go.
There are so many different ways that the word evangelical can be defined, and it will vary from denominations, nations, cultures. So for purposes of the book, could you share how you chose to what definition you chose to use?
Generally, we stay with Bebbington's quadrilateral definition. David Beddington, some years ago, a scholar in England, did an analysis of our history and our theologies and came up with 4 basic points that would define an evangelical. One would be the trustworthiness of the Scripture. Second would be conversion, the importance of conversion. The third would be that salvation is only through Jesus Christ. And the fourth is the importance of witness and doing good deeds. So you've got, in some cases, I know in Canada we did a national survey using that as our grid, and I think we found 15 to 17% of Catholics consider themselves evangelicals. The conversion aspect would generally identify, would be a clear marker, wouldn't it, Todd, as to a person, say, in the Roman Catholic Church or in the mainline churches. They might believe in the Scriptures or the other things. Would that be the
Yeah, I mean, for the most part, people in the mainline and in the Catholic or Orthodox tradition don't use the language of personal conversion. It's not prevalent, but it actually has made its way in So some people like that.
The other is that salvation is only through Jesus Christ. So that exclusivity is a very important marker. So that's generally what we've been using. That is a definition. Yeah. But of course, the word evangelical becomes synonymous with enthusiasm. You know, he's an evangelical salesman. So but we still think the word is worth saving. It's a good New Testament word. It's the word that Luther used to describe his followers. It's the Roman Catholics that called us Protestants. We didn't call ourselves Protestants. We were evangelicals. And it has a good history, even though tragically in the U.S. it becomes a name for a voting bloc.
Do you address kind of also kind of those liabilities within the book as well?
Yes, in some, maybe not as clear as I've just identified. I think we work more on the affirming side, what we believe it is, rather than the detractors or the downsides. Do you know of any place?
Yeah, well, we don't focus, for one thing, we're not focused on the U.S. and trying very hard not for that to dominate. For example, Evangelicals in Politics is a very interesting article. You probably have never read an article like this one because the assignment was clear. Do not focus, just on one area. So I think almost every article shows some of the downsides and the struggles. Like Aida said about, okay, here's areas we agree, but here's areas where there's tension. Evangelicals in Science is certainly going to show a wide range of views, and not all positive, related to that. So I think actually, because all of the authors were trying to be somewhat balanced, you're going to get, a wide range of that. But it won't reflect any one national position. That was one thing crystal clear in the assignments that were given. And that's why many of these articles, I think, simply do not exist anywhere except in this book, because they're almost always written within a national context, and this was meant to be deliberately international.
The article on Roman Catholics and Evangelicals, it shows both sides, our relationships, positive and negative.
I'd like to ask both Dr. Spencer and Brian if you have a sense of whether there's a movement in either direction regarding women's role in ministry in the evangelical church. Both of you, I know, have travels and connections all over the world, all over the evangelical world.
We're recording, so it'd be nice to get your... So this will be broadcast all over the world within moments, but don't be afraid.
Chris, your question is there a movement among churches related to women?
Evangelicals, if you sense a tending in one direction or the other toward more complementarian, hierarchical versus egalitarian?
So, it depends on the day and what news you read, huh? But I thought that was the interesting part that I did, to check a number of denominations now, and I contacted their offices. And it seems to me that some denominations are clearly ending up affirming women that maybe weren't sure, and then other ones are just firm on the other side. So it seems to me that there's more solidification going on, at least in the United States. I don't know around the world if there's a lot of changes going on. To some extent, I know when I've traveled in Latin America, like I've gone to some of the bookstores, and what I've often found is like the far right and the far left in terms of translated material from the United States. Yeah. I'll have super conservative material and then super liberal material, and the more moderate position, which I think we tend more to represent at Gordon-Conwell, doesn't tend to be translated as much.
The third point I mentioned today is about the indigenization of leadership. But there's also called the indigenization of theology. So no longer is it always an American import that becomes the prevailing theology. So you have an Africanization and the theology very much coming out of their experience and their worldview. Generally, I find that the openness to women in all levels of leadership is increasing, and I think one of the prime reasons is because the Pentecostal charismatic movement. The Pentecostal movement from its beginning ordained women. So I remember back in the, when I was with the Evangelical Fellowship in the 80s, and there was a debate over the ordination of women. And we got into a conversation, and I said, well, I came to faith through a Pentecostal woman evangelist. I came into my Pentecostal experience through a professor who was a woman. And the first 3 years when I was preaching, I preached from the notes of a woman preacher. So I said, I don't even know what the question is anymore. So I think with the influence of the Pentecostal charismatic movement worldwide, it has carried with it an understanding of gifts not being gender selective. So I think the trend is that way. Now, there are, I don't know whether this is an American-driven movement, but there is a kind of what I would call a neo-fundamentalist reform movement that is driving us back the other way on the gender issue. And it finds its way, those conferences find its way in the most surprising places. But I think that's more particular than general.
Okay. Neil?
Yeah. Question from, maybe it's more of a WEA issue, but also in the book would be Eastern Europe, I think of as being one of the places where the word evangelical, I think, always had a bad name. And I'm wondering, especially from the eyes of whether it's communists or Orthodox, is there any progress one way or another in recognition of the evangelical place?
I know in Greece, the government will not use the word evangelical, they use the word Protestant. Because the Greeks tell me that the word evangelical is close to a word like martyr. So they'll not use it. They'll just not use an official language. So it's exempt there. I haven't found in Eastern Europe the word evangelical to be problematic. Now, of course, in Russia, they use the word Baptist, and the word Baptist means evangelical. In Egypt, the word Presbyterian or Protestant means evangelical. So they use the three words interchangeably. But I don't know of anywhere else in Eastern Europe where it's problematic. Do you?
No, I don't. I saw an opposite example, by the way, just last week in Brazil, and that is that even on the census, you click the word Catholic, and then you another box for evangelical. The word there means Protestant in that context, and they don't even have a word in Portuguese that means what we mean on the cover of this book. So they have to qualify it, there's no Portuguese word, and there were actually proposals for new words at this meeting that would be a slight variation of the word that's used in Portuguese that essentially means Protestant. So that's actually one indication that the terminology is not even consistent all across the world, even though the community is pretty clearly defined, even in Brazil. Actually, that's not true. Should I tell the story about? Oh, I guess I have to now. Okay, so we were at this missions researchers meeting, and we were discussing how they wanted to define evangelical, and they said they really liked the Operation World theological model, where you look for people that act like evangelicals, even if they don't self-identify. And so I brought up the idea of the Universal Church of the Kingdom of God, which is they built a huge temple, Solomon's temple. In fact, it's bigger than the one in the Bible, so that tells you something right there. It's a neo-Pentecostal group. The pastor is a billionaire, so there are slight problems in the church. So anyway, they have a huge movement all over Brazil, and we said, well, let's just ask you, what percentage of the universal church of the kingdom of God is evangelical? So one person said 20%. And these are very knowledgeable people about every movement in Brazil. Another person said 30%, and then someone chimed in and said, no, it's 5%. And then another person said 50%. And then we said, well, this is very interesting because we say, the Center for the Study of Global Christianity says 0, because they don't self-identify as evangelical, and Operation World says 100. So there you go. It's clear. It's between 0 and 100 is the way you can be. You can be certain of that. That's the one thing you can be certain of. Okay, so
have you admitted you're wrong?
Well, we're all wrong, or we're all right. One of the two. Yes.
I have 3 thoughts. One, is this going to be for one of your classes, the textbooks? Would it be of value as a textbook or a reference?
Okay, so it wasn't written as a textbook. It was written as a handbook, which would put it in pastors' studies and actually people's homes and that sort of a thing. But yes, given the content, it probably could be.
If it'll help the sales, yes.
Yeah. Yes, that's
Okay,
right.
so then I also was wondering if there was any perspectives from other religions about evangelism and stuff.
No, we decided from the beginning to define ourselves, and again, it came out of the question. Everybody is defining us. Let's define who we are to others.
Okay.
So we had a limited amount of time or space, and we kept it to that.
Okay, so then I wanted to refer to chapel. Can you talk about the difference between a calling and a nudge?
I'm sorry.
Calling and a nudge. What's the difference between calling?
Yeah, that's interesting. I suppose it's Monday night, and we're going to bed, and my wife, as we go through the kitchen, she opens the door to the garbage. That's a nudge. A calling is Tuesday morning at 7 o'clock. Brian, the garbage truck is just coming down the road. That's a calling. A nudge is an inner sense towards something, and you can read it. Maybe it was the onions in the pizza the night before. It may have been a bad dream. It may have been a news item you saw. It has no consequence. But if there's some kind of consistency to it, if there's a growing awareness, and I just think that as we ask the Spirit to make us sensitive to His voice, to His nudge, and then it's a sensitizing. A nudge is a sensitizing. Just be aware, be aware, be aware, be aware. A calling is something very specific. So for me, the nudge was a sense I should be there. The calling was when my trusted friend Dave Toyson of World Vision said, yes, Brian, you need to be there. That confirmed the nudge. So the nudge was a sense I should go. I tested it, and a person I trusted said yes. Does that make sense? Okay.
Okay, one last question, because we want you to have the opportunity to buy a book if you'd like.
Let me just say this to students. I was going to say this earlier. Those of you that are studying here, enjoy this moment of your life. This is the best moment of your life. I know you get fussed about papers and exams, and it's good that you're fussed about them because it kind of puts you on edge and makes you work a little harder. But you'll look back and you'll remember the things and the people and the ideas that came to you and the way the Lord spoke to you. So just be grateful for this moment. Work to minimize anxiety. So manage your anxiety so that the richness and the fullness of this moment will be all yours. It's a great time, and I'm delighted that you're here doing this.
Thank you. Okay, well, thank you all so much for coming and celebrating with us. We'll be here for a bit longer, but I think I'll formally let you go. And the books are in the back there. Normally $34.99, but if you act now, they'll. Oh yeah, and Brian will sign them. Brian and Todd will sign them if you want. And instead of $34.99, they're only $20, including tax. So there you go. Thank you for coming. Have a wonderful day.